Well, kia ora everyone. It is so good to be able to connect together. It's a highlight of my week, coming together and just seeing all your faces and being able to connect together. And to remember, one of our other values that we heard about too, we're part of something bigger. And, that expresses itself in a whole bunch of different ways. In fact, over the last 10 days, let me just mention like 5 of those ways that we are part of something bigger. Thursday, a week ago, we had International Director of 24/7 Prayer from UK here with us to launch 24/7 Prayer New Zealand, because we believe that our prayer is the hinge of history. It changes everything. And if we're going to step into this multiply vision and see what God can do in our country, we need to be a praying people. And so that's the launch of 24/7 Prayer. Monday just gone, we had 220 leaders from around the country right here in our auditorium with Kira Newhall from Canada, inspiring us as leaders around the well-being of and the health of leaders, along with how do we respond to some of the challenges and some of the things happening in wider society. What does future church look like? And then on Tuesday, Wednesday, we hosted Andrew Catty from City to Sydney, from Sydney, Australia. And he was coaching 15 of us as senior pastors on how we can coach church planters around our country. And then on Friday just gone, we had 500 young people packed into this room in what was called the Send, this commissioning to actually a new generation to take a stand and to be sent out as followers of Jesus. And on Tuesday coming, we have Richard Blake from Mind Health down in Christchurch speaking to our denominational leaders here, because health of leaders is so important in the wider church as well. And that's over like a 10-day period. We're part of something bigger, and so it's been a pretty intense period for our team. Our staff is heading away on a well-deserved overnight retreat, also Wednesday, Thursday this week, just to catch our breath a bit. But just want to let you know, we're part of something bigger, and God is doing something incredible in our nation right now. If you're a fan of C.S. Lewis's series Chronicles of Narnia, it's almost like Narnia is on the move. God is on the move, and he continues to inspire and raise up different people across generations to stand for him. Pretty exciting. Well, as Mel mentioned, today we're into this new series that takes us through this Lent season right up to Easter, called The Crux of It. And if you Google Crux, you'll find this meaning here. Crux, the decisive or most important point of an issue. And the crux of history ultimately goes back to the decisive moment when Jesus was crucified. Really, the cross is that pivot point that changes everything in history. It's this turning point. Effectively, everything is changed or can be changed because of what happened on the cross of Jesus. Now, when we kind of talk about what happened on the cross, we call it the gospel. And the Bible has like no one picture or one way to describe the gospel. And instead, it gives us numerous pictures, numerous metaphors and places to describe the depth and the breadth of what Jesus did on our behalf and how our lives can change. And so everything, every week in the season that we call Lent, right through to Easter, we want to hone in each week on just one of those images. And what I love about these images is they are simple and incredibly profound. Of course, the irony is that we tend to take these pictures, and people in past history like to put big sounding theological words next to those pictures, of words like justification and reconciliation and substitution and Christus Victor and redemption, and these big sounding theological words. And often when we hear these words, many of us, we can respond in different ways. Some will just like freak out and withdraw emotionally and just like run for the hills because it just sounds really dry and irrelevant to us. Others of us almost like kind of get, switch on our academic prowess as if that this is only something for scholars and theologians. But what many people tend to miss in these like big sounding theological words are actually behind each of them is an incredibly simple and profound image used to describe the profound and significant and very personal work of Jesus for each one of us. Now, if you're not yet a person of faith, this series is going to be helpful for you in your journey, because it's going to help you come to grips with what the gospel is about and what the work of the cross actually means for you personally. It's really going to help you identify the problem behind all the problems that you see, and therefore also the solution that God has in place for you. If you are a person of faith, this is going to help you reappreciate the work of Jesus and help you explain it to your friends. Because as we've spoken about over the last couple of weeks, we have this multiply vision. If we're going to be stepping into that, we need to be inviting people and able to explain this good news of Jesus to other people. And each one of these pictures helps us do that. It's also going to help you identify the problem, again, that exists within our own lives and the way the cross is always the solution to that problem. It always comes back to preaching the gospel, not just to other people, but to ourselves every single day and every single moment of the day. So today, we're going to be unpacking this theological word, redemption. And the first mention of that word redemption throughout the Bible comes in a very real story in the book of Exodus. And in that very real story today, I want to kind of unpack some of it, but I want to do so by telling a fictional story of Tobiah and Miriam to help us understand the breadth of the story. Tobiah and Miriam were born slaves in Egypt. They had never, ever known freedom. Their lives consisted of responding to the commands of their Egyptian slave master and to do something. And those tasks included a pyramid building for Pharaoh, decorating the palace for Pharaoh, sowing and reaping crops for Pharaoh, taking care of the farm for Pharaoh. They woke up early, they worked late through the night. They were slaves that ultimately belonged to, you guessed it, Pharaoh. They had 2 children, Korah and Deborah, but even their children didn't belong to them as parents. Really, they belonged to Pharaoh. Their children were also slaves. Now, in the early days, the Egyptians encouraged them to have children. After all, more children, the more labor there is, more slaves there are to kind of do something for Pharaoh. But over time, the Israelite community just grew so fast. They outnumbered the Egyptians. The Egyptians were fearful of revolt. And so the Egyptians mandated that every male born needed to be killed. No more baby boys born. Horrid situation. And when somebody's in slavery, they don't have rights, they're just chattel, so they couldn't do anything about it, they're just oppressed. And they've been this way for way too long. Their parents were slaves. Their grandparents were slaves. In fact, they could trace back 13 generations all the way back, 400 long years of slavery. And things have been different back 400 years ago, but ever since then, all they have ever known is slavery. Back then, there was this idea of freedom. Freedom. It's a strange word, isn't it? It's a word that once inspired Tobiah and Miriam with this radical hope. But you know how it goes. You might have an idea and the next, it kind of gets you through a hard day and maybe a hard week, but when you've kind of been through that cycle again and again and again and again and nothing changes and you've been through that 13 generations and you've been through that for 400 years, hope just seems to disappear. Just go. The idea of freedom is all behind us. It just seems to be this idea that maybe was out there, some pie in the sky, but now all they know is slavery. And it seems like slavery is all they will ever know. Now let's kind of pause there in our story and consider how their story actually relates to our story and how this relates to this idea of redemption. Because redemption is this picture word, and the picture it conveys is actually one of the slave market. Now, slavery conveys a whole lot of different emotions, and it should. Because slavery in all its forms is wrong and deeply oppressive. But what's interesting is slavery is the word Jesus himself uses to talk about the problem behind our ultimate state, our ultimate condition. This is how Jesus describes it as slavery. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is say it, slave to sin. Now, when I think of slavery, there's a picture that I tend to have that involves chains. They might be shiny chains, they might be rusty chains, but nevertheless they're chains. And often in slavery, it might not be a physical chains that people have, but it's like a chaining of the heart and of the mind, and everything just seems to go because you are oppressed. And so when you hear the words of Jesus that, everyone who sins is a slave to sin, you might go, well, I don't kind of carry chains around with me. That doesn't seem to apply to me. But many of you understand this acutely. Many of you understand it might not be on the outside, but you kind of feel that on the inside. And while you don't have chains wrapped around you, you have this kind of sense of something's not right. There's this like hopelessness that you face where you've actually come to that realization that you can't redeem yourself. You can't free yourself from this bondage that you're under. You see, this is what Tobiah and Miriam experienced. And Jesus says that slavery is experienced by everyone who sins, which is actually every single one of us. Now, that word sin also gets confusing, doesn't it? And we've almost like taken that word now and twisted it around to mean something even good. So we say things like, that dessert was like so sinful. It's the weirdest definition you could come up with. But genuine sin is all about the destructive choices that we make that cause harm to others and to ourselves. It comes from a heart that is disoriented and disordered with these various desires. That we might even now like do good things, but because it comes from a disordered heart, there's something sinister and messed up about the whole thing. And what we ultimately do actually affects our relationship with God as well. And so Jesus says these disordered desires place us in some form of bondage. That these things that we do, these wrong choices we make, actually place us under a power that now has mastery over us, so that we could actually be described as being enslaved to sin. So every decision we make, this chain starts to wrap itself around us. We get enmeshed in it. We can't escape the weight of it. It just happens everywhere. We step into different relationships and we think things are going well, and we start to find it just like wraps itself around us. And it's this heaviness that we carry, and whether they're shiny or rusty, it's just everywhere we go, we carry these chains with us. And there's a heaviness attached to it. Now, some of you understand this as you think about the things you struggle with. There's addictions, there's particular vices you struggle with. It might be alcohol, it might be porn, it might be promiscuity, it might be addiction to prescription drugs or illicit drugs. And it feels like you're kind of caught in this web. And you know what it's like to feel like something has this grip around you and it holds you tight, and everywhere you go, it's always there. And even though most other people aren't aware of it, internally you just realize you're stuck in something. And so from just your own experience, you acutely understand what Jesus says here, that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And there is this like entrapment, and you feel it. And what I've discovered over many years as a pastor is that, in fact, all of us, whether there's an addiction officially or not, all of us have a predisposition to something that's not right. And it leads to these different distorted patterns of behavior in our lives. Many times that can be traced back through kind of a family of origin, your family line. Sometimes it happens from something that happened in your past or in your background. Or there might be something where you can actually trace it back to some decision you made. It might be decades ago, years ago, and from that point on, it's always been something that you try to keep doing, and you try not to, but you just feel like that there's weight and this chain that kind of keeps you weighed under the whole thing. And ultimately, all of that, Jesus says, comes from this corrupt system within. You could kind of call it a corrupt operating system in our lives. And so every good action that we do ultimately has this corrupt operating system within. And so oftentimes that will come out in different ways. And so again, you might be programmed to do something, you're trying to do something, but there's like this programming within, and something just gets distorted. Or somebody presses your buttons and they press that button and it comes out in a really terrible way. See, our sin has caused us to be in slavery to this master of sin, and ultimately what we do, we're under the mandate and the command of that one who enslaves us. Tells us to spread a rumor, and we do it. And it becomes a habit for us. And we instinctively keep going to gossip as our instinctive response. And so when we hear about something that we could also add to that grapevine, we just like impulsively do it. And it's like, where did that come from? Or your master challenges you to strike out with somebody in anger, and again, you do it. And you don't kind of take time to listen and hear what happened. Your instant response is just like, whew, and this volcano erupts. What Jesus referred to as sin. According to Jesus, there's no, get out of jail free card like Monopoly. Rather, this is one of those, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go to jail card. We're all in this bondage together. Let's go back to the story of Exodus with the realization, actually the story of Tobiah and Miriam is now actually our story too, because we have this shared experience of slavery. Slavery is all they knew. From generation to generation, it looked like there was no hope whatsoever. This is our situation too. But suddenly, there on the horizon was a new man named Moses. And Moses was telling the people that God was going to redeem them, that he was going to step in and bring freedom to them from slavery. And he shared the words from God himself. He said, I am the Lord, I will free you from your oppression and I will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you. That's that word we're looking at, redeeming you because you're in slavery and I'm going to bring you out of slavery. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. First, Tobiah and Miriam hearing this, they're a little bit on the skeptical side. The idea of freedom, it's that word, it's almost like this trigger word because over like 400 years as a nation and slavery, freedom doesn't seem like it's just this impossible thing in front of them. But then Moses stood before Pharaoh himself and commanded Pharaoh to release the Israelite people out of slavery. Pharaoh refused. So God sent a plague of frogs. Frogs were like everywhere, under the dining tables, in the beds, in the cupboards. It was gross. Pharaoh still refused. And so God sent another plague, flies everywhere, and then boils, and then hail, and then locusts, and plague after plague. God sent these things because he's trying to say, you've got to free my people, or there's going to be consequences for the oppression that you have brought onto them. Many of these times, Pharaoh promised that, okay, I'll release the people, but then he was never a man of his word. He just reneged and placed the people under even more oppression. But tonight, Moses had told them, get ready, because this was going to be their final night in slavery. Because, Pharaoh's heart was so hard. Tonight, the eldest son throughout the land would die as a result of the oppression and stubbornness of the Egyptians placing the Israelite people under slavery. And to avoid being caught up in what God was going to do, the Israelite community of faith just had to do one thing. They were to take a lamb and they were to kill it at twilight, take some of that blood and then smear it on the outer doorposts of their front door. Everybody that did that was told that when God came over their house, he would pass over where he saw the blood and would just judge the Egyptian people for the way they had placed the Israelites into slavery. Moses said God would pass over the house where the blood was and he would spare the eldest son. The promise was that this night would actually be their final night in slavery. And of course, this night was understandably called the Passover because God would pass over the house and he would bring hope and he would bring freedom or redemption. And sure enough, everything happened just as God said. All the firstborn sons in Egypt died, and the Israelites, the ones who had placed that blood on the front door of their house, survived the night. Pharaoh had enough. He sent the people, told them to go away, get out of Egypt. We don't want you around anymore. Imagine that the people have finally experienced redemption. Freedom is now something they can actually experience. Of course, days later, Pharaoh would change his mind and he sent an army after them to try to gather the people again and bring them back into bondage. But the people came to a Red Sea and God parted the Red Sea and the people of faith went through the Red Sea. The Egyptians tried to hunt them down and God collapsed the Red Sea on them, and the Israelite community now had a sea dividing them from Egypt. So Egypt was now behind them and they were a free people, sold out for God. This is the story of the Exodus. And it's called the Exodus because the people were in bondage to slavery. They were in oppression to the Egyptians, and God rescued them. He redeemed them. He exited them from Egypt and was taking them to the promised land, to a future where they would be his people and he would be their God, and they would be able to live as free people. And the word the Bible uses to describe that movement is this word redemption. Redemption. It's a beautiful word with a beautiful story behind it, isn't it? Freedom from slavery. And the story of Exodus is the picture the Bible gives to us to understand the work of Jesus in your life and in my life. As we saw earlier, Jesus describes the problem behind our problems as slavery to sin. But the work of Jesus on the cross is one that comes to break the chains and take the heaviness away from us so that we can actually experience freedom, that we are no longer in bondage anymore. And how does that happen? We read the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, that word ransom is probably a familiar word to us. We might talk about a family member or a friend being kidnapped, and the kidnappers might demand a ransom cost, payment of money in order to bring freedom to the person who has been kept in bondage, to be kidnapped. In the New Testament, it didn't quite have that meaning. Instead, it was a common term for something that happened in a marketplace. It didn't refer to a victim in kidnapping. Instead, the word was used to refer to the price paid to free something or someone who was in bondage. It might be a piece of land. Perhaps, in your family line way back, that piece of land was yours, and so you would come and you would pay a ransom in order to get that piece of land that was historically yours, to claim it back for yourself and free it from the bondage it's been in over these past few years or decades or centuries, and it's now free to be your family again. So ransom was paid. Or it was also used to buy slaves in the slave market. You see, sadly, in New Testament times, the Romans would bring people from the cities they had conquered and they had taken control over, and they would bring these people into slavery. Historians say that about 10% through to 20% of the entire population of Rome was in slavery. So people would go to the slave market and they would purchase a slave of their choice. They could buy their own doctor, they could buy their own carpenter, they could buy their own farm manager or chef, and you would pay what was called a ransom to buy that person from where they were in the slave market, and now you owned them. And so Jesus takes that common slave market language and he says, I have bought you. I am paying a ransom price to buy you from slavery where you have been under this oppression for way too long, and I'm buying you to myself so that you can now live as a free person in relationship with me. And what was a ransom price? Well, we know it wasn't mere money. In fact, one of the followers of Jesus named Peter picks up on this. He says, you know that God paid a ransom to save you from the empty way you inherited from your ancestors. And the ransom he paid was not mere gold or silver. It was the precious blood of Christ, the sinless, spotless Lamb of God. You see what he's doing with this? That whole story of Exodus is starting to come through this, the Passover. He says God chose him, Jesus, as your ransom long before the world began. But he's now revealed it to you in these last days. First thing Peter says here is Jesus pays the ransom. Jesus pays the ransom to set us free from our slavery to sin. But it's not just like some financial transaction, but he offers himself, the shed blood of himself, his life for our life. And you see again the connection Peter's making to this original story of the Exodus. Remember how Tobiah and Miriam took the blood of the lamb at twilight and they placed that blood on the door frame of the front door of their house, and that provided protection to their son Korah. And what happened that night provided redemption for them and for their whole people to be set free from slavery that they were in. And it's like Jesus is saying, I'm taking that role of that Passover lamb. And so I'm going to die, and if you take my blood, the blood of the cross, and kind of apply it kind of over the front door of your life, well, that's the ransom price. It's going to enable me to pass over your life. It's going to enable me to bring redemption to you and your story, and you are going to be free. Now, as I'm speaking to some of you, you're going, well, it's a wonderful story, but, honestly, these chains are so wrapped around my life, you don't understand what it's like to be me. You don't understand my background. I just feel like this is beyond redeeming. There's too much pain. There is too much sin. There is too much stuff that has gone on in my life. Or it might be not you, but as you think about somebody else, it might be a friend or a family member or somebody that has hurt you in the past, and you just go, that person is beyond redemption. But you see, when you understand what Jesus did on the cross, you can't say that anymore. You can't say about anybody, they're a hopeless case. They're beyond redemption, because no one is beyond redemption. No one. No one is beyond redemption. In fact, can you say that to the person next to you? No one is beyond redemption. And it doesn't matter what happened to them or to you or to anybody, because what we believe about what happened on the cross is the work of Jesus is more powerful than anything we might do. Jesus' power on the cross is able to break the chains and actually bring freedom to every single person. So how does anyone receive this redemption? This book in the New Testament called Hebrews, and the writer picks up again on the story of Exodus and uses it to describe what we do. He says, it is by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorpost so that the angel of death would not kill the firstborn sons. It is, say it, by faith that the people of Israel went through the Red Sea as though they were walking on dry ground. And when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned. You see, Hebrews 11 picks up on like the Exodus story and uses it to apply it to our Christian faith. And says, the Egyptian sons died because they didn't have faith, but the people of Israel were freed because of their faith. And so when we apply the death of Jesus to our lives and acknowledge that he has become our substitute, his life for our life, it's called faith. We trust in his work in order that I don't need to work for this. It's the work of redemption, of freeing us. We don't cause death to pass us by. We just respond in faith. Now, at one moment when that happens, you were in slavery, and the very next, when you apply that faith, you are now free. You're completely free. The chains are gone. The chains are behind you. It's a moment when you apply the death of Jesus to your life, and you move from being in a state of slavery and bondage and oppression to an estate of freedom and joy and life and peace. This is the story of the Bible. You see, it's not your moral effort that ever breaks the chain. It's the work of Jesus, and that work happens immediately in your life when you receive it by faith. Now, somebody might be saying right now internally, can't get this, saved by grace apart from works, got nothing to do with whatever I might do apart from my moral efforts. But you got to believe. You've really got to have that confidence in what Jesus has done without any doubt whatsoever, because it's by faith we're saved. So we need to really rally up our faith. Can't have any doubt at all. But just don't do that. Because what you're implying now is it's the quality of your faith that saves you rather than the object of faith. You see, it's easy to place our faith almost in faith in faith, rather than faith in the object of our faith, Jesus, and what he does to break the chains. You see, the Israelites were redeemed. They were freed from slavery, not because of their faith, but because of the way they stepped out and placed the blood over their doorpost. And I'm sure some people that did that were a little cautious about it. Some were a little, some had more confidence, and some were a little worried about what might happen that night. I'm sure some went out and they placed that blood on the doorpost and they yelled out, God is on our side. Eat your heart out, Pharaoh, because we're out of here. We're free. Incredible confidence. I'm sure others placed the blood on that doorpost, but they had a lot of doubts, a lot of uncertainties. I can imagine Miriam checking on her son Korah constantly through the night. Is he still alive? Is he still here with us? I imagine Tobiah regularly going outside to make sure that blood is still smeared out there because he's just unsure, uncertain of what might happen. I can imagine many of the elders' sons in the Israelite community kind of lying awake at night going, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and just cautious and worried about the whole thing. But here's the thing. They all had different qualities of faith, but they're all equally saved. They were all equally redeemed. Why? Because you are not saved by the quality of your faith. You're saved by the object of your faith. It was the blood of the Lamb that Tobiah placed on their doorpost that ultimately brought them freedom. In the same way, it is the work of Jesus that you apply to your life, even when you have some doubts about it, that brings you freedom from your slavery as you step into freedom. And this is a moment that has a decisive beginning. Often that moment is expressed in prayer. And if you've never been in that place before where you've kind of been exploring faith and you wonder what that moment looks like, often it's a prayer. There's no magical words, but it's when somebody says something like, Jesus, I acknowledge that what I've done, I guess my sin is this barrier, it is this problem, and now there's like this separation between us. But I'm trusting in Jesus and the work of Jesus to bring the healing and the salvation that I need so that I can be in relationship with you from here on in. Again, there's no words you have to say for that to happen, but when you do in faith, it's like you've smeared blood over your life, the blood of Jesus over your life, and there is immediate change in your status from being in bondage to slavery to sin to actually being a free person. And it happens immediately. The very moment you step out in faith and trust Jesus. And so the Bible says, Christ has truly set us free. Can you say it with me? Christ has truly set us free. At the very moment, those chains that we have carried for like so long, they're broken. And sin is no longer our master. We don't have to listen to his commands anymore. We can ignore it because Christ has redeemed us. Christ has set us free. But before we go on and celebrate that, there's one other thing I need to say. Sadly, it's this. Sometimes we return to slavery. And it sounds like this ridiculous idea, doesn't it? But it is something we all experience in our own lives. Once again, we see it in the story of Tobiah and Miriam. Because once Tobiah and Miriam crossed that Red Sea and Egypt was behind them and they're now like heading towards the promised land, they're now free people. It's like there's something within that, like the familiarity of the past that like calls us back to what we knew when we were in slavery. This is what we read about in a Bible book called Numbers. The Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and garlic we wanted. You notice what they're kind of missing in the narrative of the past? Well, actually, you were in like bondage. You were a slave. You couldn't even make your own decisions. Yes, you had free accommodation. Yes, you had free food. But you had no freedom to make any decision at all. And isn't that like what we do so often? As we think about our past and we change the narrative and we forget about actually what that was really like. And yes, there's some good things about our past, but slavery is still slavery. You see, sometimes we return to what's familiar. It's almost like we want to return to Pharaoh calling the shots because it's a familiar voice and we know what the rules are. You might have heard before about Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is the phrase used to often describe the coping mechanism of a captive or someone in an abusive situation. And somehow a person that's gone through relationship abuse or child abuse or sex trafficking can almost like develop these positive feelings toward their captor or somebody that has been abusing them over time. And it sounds absurd. But it's why an abused spouse can go back to an abuser, because there's something familiar. And it's hard to think of life in any other way. There's like some safety net, it would seem, around it all. And I think the same thing happens to us spiritually. It's like spiritual Stockholm Syndrome. And that's why the Apostle Paul says this. So Christ has truly set us free. Now, make sure you stay free. Don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. Because though Jesus has broken the chains and provided freedom, so often, Paul knows very well from his own experience, there is something in the past calling us back, and we want to take on these heavy chains and we kind of wrap them all around ourselves again. And we do it because of a spiritual Stockholm Syndrome. And it's like we develop these positive feelings about our spiritual captors and abusers. And we forget that the sin actually places us in bondage. So you think, how might that happen? Well, I think it just It might be a habit that keeps calling you back. That vice, that decision you made way back there, even though the cross has set you free from its power, you allow it to start wrapping its tentacles around your life again, and you start carrying the heaviness of these weights, and it kind of forces a whole lot of things around you, and it's hard. Or you return to slavery that's driven by the expectations of others. And there's like this heaviness to the expectations, either that you place on yourself or that other people, parents, culture, whatever has placed on you. And even though you should be free from the weight of those expectations, you still carry it because you think you need to be somebody in order to be genuinely free. Or it might be the shame that you have experienced for so long. You know, failure, I think we all understand, can be this heavy weight that we carry around with us. And because of that shame, we often feel like we need to hold on to these chains. It's almost like some sort of penance we're going to take with us because, well, what I did in the past, it was so bad that, yes, Jesus might save me, but I need to prove myself. I need to show that I'm a person worthy to be loved now, that I'm a person worthy to be respected. And so we try all these things without understanding that actually the grace of Jesus, the beauty of the gospel, is he loves you regardless of what you've done. And your respect has nothing to do with who you are as a person. It has everything to do with who Jesus is and the respect he places on you. It's called the gospel. But so many of us live with the shame and the expectations and the weight, and we just wrap it all around us. And it's hard when we're still holding onto these chains. We try to worship and we try to hold up our hands, but the weight of the chains, it's just too hard. Or we try to serve other people and these chains just get in the way and it's too clunky. Or we try to be in a relationship with people, but the chains are always keeping us, that person at a distance, because what we have to do is deal with the chains every single day. And it's not just something we do in the past, but we believe Christ has truly set us free, and so we need to stay free. And we need to allow the gospel to deal with the chains continually every single day. Christ has truly set us free. So now make sure you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. In other words, get out of slavery and stay out of slavery. Because these chains need to be placed on Jesus. This is what happened at the cross. We believe that when Jesus died, he took on all the sin, all the oppression, all the stuff that has been done to us and by us. And he wrapped itself around him so that we don't have to deal with it any longer. So Jesus takes on the oppression or the slavery that we ourselves had and we're responsible for. And Jesus rises again from the dead to break those very chains. And so we can now live as free people. Christ has set us free. And so each day we need to wake up and remind ourselves of that and allow those words to travel that 30 centimeters down to our heart and realize we're free people. Don't get caught up again in slavery. So one of the things we do here most Sundays is we gather for communion because it's a way of preaching the gospel, not just out there, but to ourselves. That we look again at the cross, this beautiful cross about redemption and about our story that we were in slavery, but now we are free people. And so today, as you come to the table, there's going to be somebody there with a stamp. It has the word paid. I encourage you just to put your arm out and just receive that stamp paid so that throughout the rest of today, you can just go through this day and remember, Jesus has paid the ransom price. And because of that, regardless of what has happened in my past, regardless of what I'm struggling with right now in my present, Jesus has paid the ransom price and I am now free. Christ has set me free. And once you've got that stamp from people here at the tables, then take the bread and the cup and remember the work of the cross for you. What it is, the costly blood of Jesus that provides our ransom, that pays our ransom to move us from slavery to freedom. Now, if you're online today, you obviously don't have one of those stamps unless you're an accountant, and so go grab one. But you might just even want to write those words, paid. So the rest of today is just there in front of you, reminding you, I need to remember, Christ has set me free. Jesus sets us free from slavery. So let's live as free people. Let's us stand together as we pray. Oh, Jesus, just thank you. Because we have carried chains with us for all of our lives. Many of us have calluses and difficulty and disabilities in our lives because of what we've faced spiritually. And thank you for the way that you step in and you bring healing and you bring freedom. And pray for every single person connecting today that we would know the freedom that you bring. Not a freedom that we earn, not a freedom that we can make happen, but a freedom that's received. Thank you for the power of the cross, an incredible power that's able to break the heaviness and the largest of chains. And so we come hungry to the table, knowing that you have paid our ransom and that our slavery is gone and that we are free people. And so, Father, would you help us to live as free people with a lightness in our step, with a genuine peace and an abundant joy. Thank you that we are now free. Thank you that we are now free. And we all said, amen. Amen.